Hello and welcome to my channel. This lovely mountain scene was done in pastels and pastel pencils. Let's have a look at the drawing process. The scene can be roughly divided into three parts. The first one at the bottom is the meadow, and then there are some mountains or layers of mountains in the middle, and of course at the top is the sky with some clouds. I'm doing the sketch with a colored pencil and then I'm going to switch to pastel. The paper I'm working on is UART 800 sanded paper. I'm going to use this textured surface for working with pastels. I'm going to use pastels of various brands, and I'm starting to work on the sky. At the bottom I'm going to use some of this light sky blue pastel. I'm going to use soft pastels for these larger areas, for blocking in larger areas, and then I'm going to use pastel pencils for some of the smaller details. I'm covering everything with this light blue pastel, and after that I'm blending with my finger. I'm using the Kohinoor soft pastels, and I'm also going to use the Kohinoor pastel pencils. In addition to those, I'm going to use some other brands that I have lying around. Anyway, at the top I'm using a slightly darker and more vibrant blue. This is like a middle phthalo blue, and I'm going to mix these two together, or blend them rather. And I'm going to try to achieve a nice smooth gradient where the sky is a bit darker at the top and getting a bit lighter near the horizon. After that I'm going to draw some clouds, and for those of course I'm going to use a white soft pastel. Now I have to tell you, I actually used a little bit of fixative before this layer. I don't often use fixative in between the layers, but sometimes it can be useful to do so because there's less dust flying around, there's less mudding and blending of colors. So if you want slightly cleaner marks and less mudding, you can fix a little bit in between the layers. So I'm drawing a group of clouds here to the right. There's a large shape here, but I will be kind of breaking it up into smaller shapes here at the bottom. Adding more and more of these smaller scattered clouds which are detached from the rest of the group. And doing the same thing on the other side as well. Just a bunch of smaller scattered clouds on the horizon. So now I'm going to blend that again with my finger. With pastels, your fingers are your main blending tools. They work really well because of the texture of the skin and the natural oils in the skin. And they help you to apply the pastel to the paper and make it stick a bit better. I switched to a white pencil now to refine some of the smaller details around the edges of these clouds. What I want to achieve is not just to add some smaller details, but also to refine some of the edges of the clouds, because some of these shapes are going to have a cleaner edge against the background. In other places they will be a little bit more wispy, a little bit more blurry, if you will. Now I'm starting to add slightly darker bluish colors to create some shadow areas within the clouds. Clouds are three-dimensional objects, so depending on their position relative to the light source, they're going to have a light side, which is, in this case, is at the top, and the shadow side, which in this case is at the bottom because it's facing down or away from the light source, which is coming from above. I used a little bit of light ultramarine and a touch of this sky blue, which I used for the sky. I'm going to mix these two together and then blend gently, again using my finger, and that way I will create some suggestions of smaller shapes within that larger shape of clouds, and that will make the clouds appear more three-dimensional and also a bit more interesting and complex in terms of their shape. I'm cleaning up the edge of the horizon here, the sky blue pastel. And now I'm going to draw some distant mountains. With the distant mountains, you want to often use duller or bluish colors depending on the lighting. And in this case we're going to use some bluish colors, but I need to make this a little bit lighter. The reason is because I'm trying to imitate the atmospheric effect, where if you gaze into the distance you will see that everything becomes a bit more bluish and a bit less defined with less detail and contrast. And the objects which are stacked in front of this one will always be a little bit darker, a little bit more defined in terms of both detail and contrast. And they will also have slightly less bluish colors. But these mountains here that I'm drawing now are also a little bit further away, which is why I started with a little bit of blue pastel. But I'm going to throw in some other colors as well. First I'm blending that to get that to look smoother and to fill in those lighter spaces. And then I'm throwing in a little bit of green. So these are green mountains, or mountains with green slopes covered with grass and large patches of trees. And the closer they are to a viewpoint, the more greenish they will become, and the further away they are, the more bluish they will appear. So on the ones which are a little bit closer to our viewpoint, I'm throwing in a little bit more green. And finally, to add a bit more detail, or at least an illusion of detail to them, I'm using a black pastel to create some random marks that are supposed to look like parts of the mountain which are covered by trees, by forests. So I'm just dragging my pencil using a moderate amount of pressure, creating very small marks that leave a texture that is supposed to look like a bunch of trees on a mountain slope. If I feel like the texture is too much, I can always soften it a little bit with a blue or some other lighter pencil. But I think now you can see where I'm going with this, because the idea is to define some slightly darker parts of those distant mountains, whether they are darker because of the shadows or because their slopes are covered by trees. And for that I simply used a black pastel pencil, simple enough. But when blended with other colors, it's going to get the appearance that I was going for. On top of that, I'm going over that with some more green, making those slopes a little bit more greenish. And as I move on to the midground and the foreground area, I'm going to use some brighter greens, because this slope will be completely green, either dark green or light green, and it's much closer to our viewpoint. Just adding a little bit more detail here to these mountains. The thing is that these are just suggestions of shapes, suggestions of details. You don't really have to try to define every single individual shape. Anyway, we're going to have lots of trees on this mountain slope. Some of them are going to appear a bit larger than the others. First I'm going to block in this whole area with a bit of this light green. I'm starting with a lighter color. I can put darker colors on top of that easily. But on this surface I can also work from dark to light as well. There's that option as well. It just there are limitations to that, because once you put down enough pastel, the colors start to become a little bit muddied, and it becomes a little bit difficult to put in cleaner marks. But you know, I don't really have to worry about that right now. I'm just blocking in this large area with some green pastel, and I'm going to refine the details a bit later. And of course, I blended that with my finger, and now I'm starting to work on the details using a black pastel pencil again. I'm going to draw some shapes of trees here at the top. And one of the things that you can probably see is how these shapes have a little bit more shadow at the bottom, and that the shadow is being cast from right to left. That's because, from what I can tell from the reference, the light is coming more from the right side, which means that there will be more shadow to the left, and all of these taller objects on that mountain slope will be casting a bit of shadow to the left. Now I'm going to move on to this left side, and I'm going to work from left to right. I just did the top of the mountain there, but now I'm going to start from this side. And first I'm going to draw some of these larger trees in the foreground, and the way that I'm going to do that, first it's not going to look like much, but as I keep working and as I keep adding value and detail, it will start to make more sense. So the way that I'm going to do this is just by dragging my pencil and creating very small marks, keeping my strokes very short, either going in a circular motion or back and forth. And what I'm trying to create here is an illusion of foliage. So for the trees which are closer to the foreground, I'm going to try to create larger shapes, and for the trees which are covering the slope in the background, I'm going to use smaller marks. And occasionally I can also draw an outline or the shape of the tree or a group of trees, and then work around that in order to make sure that its edges remain lighter. That way the tree will stand out against the background, because in these trees there will always be some shadow areas, and those will generally tend to be at the bottom or deeper inside the canopies, whereas on the outer edges of the canopies, where the clusters of leaves are sticking out, they are more exposed to the light source, so they will be catching more light, and they need to appear lighter. And another thing to remember, of course, is that the light is coming not just from the top, but also a little bit more from the right. Anyway, I'm just wiggling my black pastel pencil, trying to produce that texture that looks like foliage. I know that a lot of people would recommend against using a black pastel pencil in such a way, but I find that it's a very quick and easy way to create darker areas or shadow areas, especially when you're drawing foliage. So it's very quick and easy. Black over green, you create texture, you create shapes and textures that look like trees and their foliage. It's relatively quick, it's simple, and you only use a couple of colors. Just drawing the shapes of a couple more groups of trees here in the middle. and then covering this whole left slope with a bunch of trees. At a distance they look like a lot of smaller, lighter and darker shapes bunched together. You can see how these trees are now casting a shadow to the left, down that slope. It's very important to stay consistent with those shadows, because that's what will make this look realistic. You see, a regular viewer who doesn't know much about drawing, they don't think about shadows, they don't think about the position of the light source, but they will pick up on these subtle details. They will still be able to see whether something looks realistic or not. You as an artist, you need to be aware of these things always. So if the trees at the top are casting a shadow to the left, the trees in the middle and elsewhere also need to be casting their shadows to the left. I'm covering the top of the mountain there with a bunch of trees. A good part of that slope is covered by, you might call it a carpet of trees, which almost merge into a single shape. But to make things more interesting, we'll throw in a few of these scattered trees and bushes which are detached from the rest of the larger shape. I have a bit of a cold, so sorry if I sound a little bit strange. I'm adding another row of trees and bushes here in the middle. These are slightly smaller. And there's another row here, maybe even a fence. I can't really make out all of the details. The reference is in the description as usual, so you can check it out and see how I adapted to it. Now I'm just dragging my pencil, the black pencil, and touching the surface of the paper ever so slightly and allowing it to leave some random darker marks on the grass. That'll give the grass a bit of texture and create a little bit of random variation in the terrain. It will also alter the appearance of the grass in terms of color, because it was kind of a bright, almost radioactive green, so now it looks a bit more natural. I just keep adding some of these smaller shapes of trees and bushes. Like I said, I feel like these smaller shapes which are detached from the rest really add a lot to the realism and also to the three-dimensional appearance of the mountain. We have now reached the foreground area, and like I said, in the foreground we're going to have a meadow covered with a bunch of flowers, and just on the edge of that meadow we have another row of trees and bushes. And I'm using the same approach, just keeping my pencil strokes really small and short to imitate the appearance of that foliage. Here we have another group of trees. We can see the tree trunks. It's like two trees next to one another, and their canopies merging into a single darker shape. Just adding some more random texture to the grassy part of this slope, making it a little bit darker in places, adding a little bit more variation to the terrain. I forgot to mention, I also added a little bit of variation in color. I threw in some yellowish tones. on that slope as well. Now I'm going to tackle this foreground area. I'm going to cover it with some light green pastel first, then add a little bit of darker green in places to make it a bit darker. And then I'm going to blend everything. Now, I've already created a little bit of variation in value, but I need to add a bit more suggestion of detail in the foreground. So I'm adding some suggestions of darker clumps of grass here and there. The ones which are closer to the foreground are a little bit darker. The ones which are further away are they're also a little bit larger. The ones which are further away are a little bit smaller. I'm going over that with a lighter green pencil, kind of refining their appearance a little bit. I don't really have to try to draw every single blade of grass. With just a few suggestions, and hoping that I will get away with it. On top of that, I'm drawing some flowers. I'm going to start with some yellow flowers here in the foreground. Again, drawing some slightly larger shapes closer to our viewpoint and slightly smaller ones further away. Now I switch to a white pencil, and for the most part this meadow in the foreground will be covered with a lot of these white flowers. Again, I'm drawing larger shapes in the foreground, and then as I move further back I'm making the marks smaller and smaller, sometimes like tiny dots. I can just stab the paper like this with a pencil. And I can also use soft pastel to achieve the same effect. Now, because there are so many flowers there in the distance, they're almost merging into a single lighter shape, or slightly larger lighter shapes. So I don't have to draw dots all the time. And now I switch back to a pencil to draw some more deliberate marks in the foreground. Just adding some more here and there until I'm happy with how many of them there are. This process takes a little bit of patience. But like I said, we need to have detail in the foreground. Once that is done, I'm putting my signature here on the left side. And that's the finished drawing. I hope you enjoyed the drawing process. I hope you liked the way this scene turned out. Please check out my other videos and think about giving me a like and subscribing to my channel. I'm just adding a few more bushes here. And if you want to see more content and much longer full-length narrated videos, you should check out my Patreon. Thanks for watching. I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye bye.